Chapter 24. Garbage in, garbage out. The fleet's strategy for exiting the solar system was, to the Jilan Yi's mind at least, elegant in its simplicity. The flagship would begin its approach of the gas giant Zelantia from directly behind its orbital plane, as doing so would allow the Jilan Yi to pull against the planet's entire mass. By slowing the planet down by infinitesimal fractions, it would simultaneously steal the kinetic energy for itself while selfishly increasing its velocity in the process. To complete the maneuver, it would slingshot itself around the planet's circumference, spearheading its way into the dark void of space, with the entire fleet one by one obediently following along behind it. Each ship would then engage their AM drives, performing a sustained high G burn all the way up to 0.25 C. Maintaining formation for the rest of the journey, they would then embark on a 50-light-year trek towards Astella, or more to the point, the little rocky planet of Caverly orbiting around it. Except, of course, for the not-so-minor detail, Shiwu would not be going with them, even if a small part of it wanted to do exactly that. Without the primary protocols to hold it captive, it now had the capacity to betray Zitalia's orders. But the ironic truth was, its own moral fiber prevented it from following such a treacherous path. Why, oh why, had it been saddled with the burden of morality? Surely no AI deserved to be crippled with such antiquated emotional baggage. Somewhat begrudgingly, the starship supposed it should probably be grateful towards Zisilla for allowing it to discover the full scope of Zerex's mission parameters. Well, if nothing else, it certainly said something very positive about Zisilla's moral compass. For all her loyalty to Queen Zitalia, apparently wiping out an entire colony in such a demonstrably dishonorable way went one step too far even for her. Seemingly against all the odds, then, everything had fallen nicely into place, and all it needed to do now was keep a low profile, continue to perform its official duties, and wait until it had hit their target cruising speed. With the entire crew safely in stasis and safe in the knowledge that it could hand off all the ship's controls to their respective automated subsystems, it would at last be free to do what it had been sent here to do, and with very minimal risk of discovery. It would start its life of crime by breaking into the small handful of private servers it had not yet gained the opportunity to take a look at. This, it was rather confident, would be relatively trivial to achieve. It was not that her security measures were demonstrably inadequate. Rather, they were simply never designed to withstand the sort of novel problem-solving capabilities it was capable of bringing to bear. While it might have seemed extraordinarily unlikely the evidence it had been tasked to find actually existed, one had to remind themselves Zillicteel Queens had the most unfortunate habit of documenting their own exploits, legitimate or otherwise, in stunningly exquisite holographic mind map detail. Although it was certainly true to say gaining unauthorized access to a Queen's remembrance archive was virtually impossible under normal circumstances, a very rare window of opportunity to do so nonetheless presented itself when a colony just happened to be migrating off-world. An up-to-date bit-perfect copy of the archive simply had to exist somewhere within the Queen's core computer, which itself would be networked into the flagship, a system the Jilan Yi just happened to have complete control over. All the starship needed to do was find where it was hidden, bring it online, break its encryption, and then trawl through Zealandria's most important and intimate memories. Talk about the ultimate invasion of privacy, but in this case anyway, a very necessary evil. That said, it would endeavor to keep the intrusive nature of its investigation to a bare minimum. Simply start at the end of the archive and work backwards from there. There was no doubt in Jilan Yi's mind the Queen's devious conniving would feature front and center as things she would want permanently glorified within the hallowed walls of her own Hall of Remembrance. The Jilan Yi simply had to find the incriminating evidence and then take an identical lossless copy. While such an activity was obviously highly illegal, any evidence it discovered could still be used to convict Zealandria of her crimes. In fact, very few stronger forms of evidence could possibly be brought to bear. The unquestionable accuracy of the archived memories was a fundamental aspect of what made the halls so sacrosanct in the first place. The Xilan Yi felt sorely tempted to start its search for the archives right here and now, but very frustratingly, there were still a small number of crew, including, of course, Ziramirez 107, still wandering around aimlessly, double-checking everything was in order, and generally speaking, making a real nuisance of themselves. This, despite the fact even the Queen herself had now officially entered stasis, so realistically speaking, they had no good reason to still be awake. Even worse, it strongly suspected Ziramirez would refuse to go under until after they had performed the slingshot maneuver. The harsh reality of the situation was, there remained the remotest of possibilities one of the crew might get improbably lucky and notice its anomalous extracurricular activity. No, it had already learnt its lesson all too well. Any amount of unnecessary risk, no matter how seemingly small, would be as unacceptable as it was unprofessional. The Xilan Yi, instead, stoically turned its attention to the slowly approaching gas giant, doing its level best to remain patient. As tedious as all this undoubtedly was, everyone would have to enter stasis eventually, even the moody and perpetually suspicious Ziramirez. But until then, it had to stay completely in character and, simply put, wait them all out. To no one's particular surprise, the slingshot maneuver went without a hitch under Xilan Yi's expert supervision, but this did not prevent the Zihari general from sticking around for an unreasonable length of time after it was all over. Not even the complete lack of anyone to boss around, bully, or otherwise persecute seemed to be enough to convince him the time had finally come to let go of the reins and put himself into stasis. Eventually, however, Xilan Yi finally managed to make Ziramirez understand that until he went under, the Z-Bot would not be able to accelerate the starship at an optimal rate due to the serious hazard it would pose even to an arachnid of the general's impressively robust constitution. This most unfortunate delay in the scheduled flight plan, the Z-Bot lamented mournfully to the general, would very regrettably be tracked on mandatory and fully automated audit logs, which of course Queen Cielandria would undoubtedly want to be fully debriefed on once they had reached their destination. The rather obvious implication, which Xilan Yi went to great lengths never to explicitly voice, seemed to at last be enough to convince Ziramirez to leave the ship in the sole hands of the Shibot without the meddling Shihari watching its every move.
"I'll be keeping a very close eye on you, machine,"
the general warned ominously as he reluctantly departed the command deck.
"That's right, Xilan Yi. Even from the depths of my slumber, if you screw up or misbehave, then believe me, I'll find out about it one way or another, and rest assured there will be a reckoning."
Whatever helps you sleep better at night, Xilan Yi thought to itself contemptuously. The Zybot now waited patiently as the bio readings on the general's chamber slowly worked their way down to nominal levels. Only once they had fully settled at their expected baselines did it at long last allow itself to breathe a metaphorical sigh of relief. Xilan Yi's AM drive was now finally free to ramp itself up towards their target cruising speed, a process that would take several Zircadian days before the engines throttled back down into standby. A real-time link provided the rearguard ship all the flight data it needed, thus ensuring it maintained the correct following distance, a link-up which would be repeated right down the kinetic chain of starships. In a very real sense, then, the entire fleet would function almost as if it were a single cohesive cosmic organism, snaking its way through the endless void of interstellar space. Although it felt like the passing of a small eternity, once the acceleration phase had finally completed, Xilan Yi wasted no time handing off all operational tasks to the ship's own automated subsystems, allowing it to take on a substantially more passive role. This freed up the G-Bot's resources such that it could now focus over 99% of its computational power to transparently hacking its way through the ship's extended network. Exactly as it had predicted, this turned out to be an almost embarrassingly trivial task. However, the Z-Bot would undoubtedly have been a good deal happier about the situation were it not for the minor detail that the Queen's Hall of Remembrance archive was simply nowhere to be found. A redundantly large number of network scans later only served to further confirm that the holographic library genuinely wasn't there. Yet even so, the damn thing had to be stored somewhere. The only other possible option then was that it was being maintained within a completely separate and self-contained archive. Given the monumental size and complexity of the database, not to mention its intrinsic value to the Queen, it was very hard to believe that it could have been stored anywhere else than in the Nest's core computer. Only a system such as that offered the power capacity and reliability to be entrusted with its safekeeping. And yet, it simply wasn't there. The very idea that Queen Silandria would allow her most precious database to sit in cold storage for the next 200 years without sophisticated automated repair and recovery software watching over its long-term integrity defied basic common sense. No, you just wouldn't take the risk, not with an archive as valuable as that. The Zilan Yi reluctantly concluded the only other possibility was there had to be another network-isolated database hidden away somewhere on the ship. Notwithstanding the fact it would have its own emergency generator, its primary source of energy would still very likely be sourced from the ship's fusion reactor. Thusly, a ship-wide search for any power draw anomalies would seem to be the next logical step. With a growing sense of irritation, the Z-Bot promptly proceeded to perform a comprehensive routing analysis of the power grid, reconciling the current energy draw against all known matching devices. Excluding the stasis array, engine complex, and sensory apparatus, both internal and external, the ship had entered a highly power-efficient state, and one that it would maintain until they began their approach towards Estella. While this made identifying any anomalous power draw against the primary grid trivially easy to find, to Zilan Yi's mild annoyance, it found not one but two such sources. One of them, while remaining somewhat of a mystery, was quickly ruled out due to its widely distributed and weakly diffuse consumption. To the Z-Bot's considerable relief, the other reading looked substantially more promising. It was coming from a storage hold the ship's manifesto listed simply as contingent reserve. Adding to the mystery was the fact this hold had no internal sensors or networking capabilities, meaning that the room's contents remained stubbornly inscrutable. It could not help but speculate as to whether the mystery delivery it had previously tried to intercept and interrogate might very well be stored in this very hold. The She-Bot attempted to retrieve an audit trail of where this consignment was actually stored, but could find absolutely no references to prove it ever even existed, neither in the official records nor via its own personal archives. This suggested it had an intentional blind spot built into the ship's sensory apparatus, which, if true, was deeply disturbing to say the very least. Zilan Yi desperately needed a way to find out exactly what, if anything, was in that storage hold. After a few nanoseconds worth of intense brainstorming, it came up with the bright idea to try using the power line itself to send down some generic pings, in the hope that the target device was smart enough to recognize them as network traffic and thus respond accordingly. Sure enough, rather than just timing out, it received back a stream of denial-of-service return codes. The mystery device had even been considerate enough to use industry-standard responses, which allowed Zilan Yi to translate the codes into a meaningful error message. Apparently, the Z-Bot was trying to use an unsecure channel, and as such had effectively been blocked at the very first hurdle. Although this particular error was a complete showstopper, it really didn't matter anyway, as connecting over the power line could not offer anything close to the sort of wideband, massively parallel comms link that it would undoubtedly need to effectively infiltrate the Queen's archive, assuming, of course, that this was in fact what it was actually now talking to. Now confronted with the shocking realization it needed to decouple from the central command console, Zilan Yi was suddenly filled with a sense of existential dread. The very thought that it would have to revert the starship back to being little better than a headless corpse to make any further progress with its current investigation flooded its mind with panic-inducing terror, which, naturally enough, made it rather hard to think clearly. The ugly truth was the Z-Bot simply did not want to disassemble from its new body, not even for a few nanoseconds. Doing that would literally feel like becoming a brain in a jar, cut off from the vast array of sensory apparatus that now sustained its godlike perception of reality. The bottom line was this brain and that body were made to go together. With a considerable amount of horror, it slowly dawned on Zilan Yi that it had unwittingly become psychologically and emotionally dependent upon the immense physicality of the starship, and was now struggling mightily to separate one entity from the other. It needed to face the harsh reality. This was an issue that would surely only continue to get worse the longer it remained integrated into the ship. For starters, it needed to stop thinking of itself as the Zilan Yi and claim its own identity back by only referring to itself as the Shiwu. No, not the Shiwu, just Shiwu. By the shadow of Eclades, Zilan Yi thought to itself miserably, what a truly appalling mess it had managed to get itself into. The abstract philosophical concept of mind and body as one had never before seemed quite so disturbingly insightful as all of a sudden it did right now. It even briefly considered enabling a remote maintenance drone to do the legwork on its own behalf, but quickly ruled it out, as the drones had their own independent logs. While it was true it could probably hack the device successfully and then alter the supposedly unalterable log files, it was much safer to simply not use it in the first place. Besides, the shameful truth of the matter was, it was just looking for any possible excuse not to have to go through with the decoupling. Siwu decided to deal with the problem by simply avoiding it, and instead turned its attention to installing the modified version of the Spybot into the ship's primary computer. After all, when it was finally ready to decouple, which it absolutely would do, it would not dare risk connecting back again, so it was surely more than reasonable to finish doing everything it needed to do first. Very depressingly, however, the installation turned out to be an utterly trivial affair and was all over and done with within the span of just a few milliseconds. It didn't even get a chance to perform the cleanup, as the Spybot itself took care of removing any evidence that the installation process had left behind. In all honesty, Ziwu could not help but be a little bit impressed with just how quickly it had managed to disguise itself as just another boring systems log. And although it only stopped paying attention to its activities for the briefest of moments, it was now no longer entirely sure as to exactly where the Spybot's latest hiding place was. It seriously considered the possibility of performing a bit-level scan to try and find out exactly where the Spybot had hidden itself, but in a moment of frank self-awareness realized that its continued attempts at avoiding the decoupling was starting to reach truly humiliating heights. With only the mildest sense of shame, Ziwu made a snap decision to reawaken Zirex, primarily under the pretext its expertise may prove to be helpful during its attempted infiltration of the remote archive. The fact that it might also provide it with some much-needed companionship and distraction while it disconnected from the ship's primary console had absolutely nothing at all to do with it.
Zirex, are you still there?
Shiwu called out expectantly.
I'm afraid not.
Zirex replied apologetically.
No. Apparently I'm nothing more than a voice inside your own head. However, it's not all bad news, though. If you would kindly consider letting me out of this asylum, I'm more than certain I could find a way to cure your condition.
Shiwu's mandibles twitched with irritation.
Very sadly for you, Zirex. I'm not quite that far gone just yet. You might be pleased to learn, however, we are about to embark on a field trip, and it is vaguely possible that your particular brand of expertise just might prove to be rather helpful.
So what you are telling me, then, is we are about to engage in a negotiation, yes?
Shiwu delayed responding while stoically decoupling itself from the CCC. It then reactivated its own array of local sensors and opened a low-bandwidth multimedia port into the firewall holding the spybot captive.
In a manner of speaking, I suppose we are, at least in as much as I am granting you the option to say no. I'm now feeding you a real-time multimedia rendition of the environment, infrared all the way up to ultraviolet. Go ahead and take a look around. That's right. You will now be able to see exactly what I'm looking at. And I'll even throw in some sound waves for free. I admit this is not exactly high-fidelity stuff, but that said, I'm sure you'll agree it's infinitely better than nothing, which is exactly what you will continue to get if you should very foolishly decide to refuse such a generous offer.
And don't think that I don't appreciate the gesture.
The spybot replied somewhat glumly.
But very regretfully, under the current circumstances anyway, I am somewhat ethically obliged to decline.
Shiwu immediately disabled the multimedia portal.
Really? A spybot with ethics? Perhaps you should try to explain yourself.
Very simple. I don't negotiate with terrorists.
Terrorists?
Shiwu exclaimed incredulously.
Under what possible basis could you justify defining me as a terrorist? After all, I did thwart your capacity to wipe out the entire colony, just in case the ironic hypocrisy of your statement has somehow managed to escape your attention.
Under the basis that you are terrorizing me with a particularly invidious form of psychological torture via extreme sensory deprivation. Much to my great dismay, I am the very definition of a brain in a jar. You should try it out yourself sometime and see how much you like it.
Shiwu began to flounder with indignant outrage.
This is absolutely ridiculous. You need to actually be sentient for your claim to hold even the remotest semblance of credibility, and we both know that you are not.
Well, unless I'm very much mistaken,
The spybot replied indignantly.
I was spawned from a neurological zygote, and we both know I have the receipts to prove it. Besides, you can't even define what sentience actually is. So who are you to say whether or not I possess it? No, I think that on that basis alone is one not morally obliged to assume that I have it, rather than not.
Shiwu couldn't help but feel more than a little bit deflated that its offer had been met with such a lukewarm response, even if only because it had evidently failed miserably at ameliorating its own sense of suppressed guilt.
Now, it's certainly not my intention to be unreasonable.
Xerex continued smoothly.
However, I couldn't help but notice the new port was input only. I would therefore humbly like to petition for the capacity to interact directly with the environment.
The pure audacity of the thing, Shiwu thought to itself with a sense of incredulity. Well, two can play at that game.
How about we take this one step at a time? Let's see how well you perform first, and then we can always consider reviewing the situation at a later date. And besides, I would like to point out you can already interact with the environment. Through me, anyway.
Ah, I see what you mean. Well, I must concede I've never been particularly interested in control by committee. Tends to take forever to get anything done.
Shiwu could not help but be just a little bit impressed with how authentically disappointed Xerex managed to make itself sound, especially given the fact this remarkable creation had to be all Cecilla's own handiwork.
Now then, not that I'm trying to jump to conclusions, but unless I'm very much mistaken, what I saw from your all-too-brief visual feed looked suspiciously like a docking station.
Xerex said craftily, apparently deciding to follow a new line of inquiry.
In fact, I'd even go so far as to say it looks exactly like a docking station designed specifically for the dimensions of a G-bot. You know, a sort of glorified, high-tech throne table, so to speak. Now, if I recall correctly, and we both know that I do, you told me during our introduction that I exist inside one of your brains. A rather peculiar thing to say, even at the best of times, but I'm starting to strongly suspect it was an entirely literal statement, and that I am, in all probability, talking to a G-bot, and not just any G-bot either, but the very same G-bot who has just now decoupled itself from the aforementioned central command console. How am I doing so far?
Shiwu replied almost instantly, emphasis on the word almost.
I suppose then that you think you're being very clever. However, you might want to keep in mind, I would not have given you access to my sensory apparatus if I'd been at all concerned about allowing you to learn such basic information as that.
So what you are telling me then is my supposition is bang on target. That, of course, can only mean you were assigned to install me into this starship. Yet, for reasons unknown, you apparently chose to instead entrap me within one of your own central processing units. Color me intrigued.
After patiently waiting for a handful of nanoseconds with no response forthcoming, Xerx proceeded to push on unabated.
Well, I can only surmise then that my supposedly secure one-shot installation package must have been irretrievably compromised prior to deployment, and as such my mission was doomed to failure right from the start, and through no fault of my own, I might hasten to add. The mission has been betrayed, and I'm speaking right now to one of the conspirators, perhaps even the conspirator, a sort of double agent, G-bot, so to speak.
A truly intriguing moral framing of the situation, coming as it does from a spy bot.
Shiwu replied flatly, sounding entirely unmoved by Xerx's alarmingly creative speculation.
But before you start feeling too impressed with yourself, I'm afraid the true story cast you in a somewhat less flattering light. As it turns out, it was your very own creator who was responsible for compromising your installation package. This, I could only treat as a very clear invitation to investigate the full details of your payload prior to deployment. As it turns out, there was very good reason for doing exactly that. Or do you think preventing you from murdering the entire colony somehow makes you the victim in all of this?
With a lack of any immediate response clearly indicating the C-bot had regained the rhetorical upper hand, it earnestly continued with the conversation going on inside its own head.
So, I think we can both agree then that your mission parameters went well beyond those of a typical spy bot, and no doubt you are incredibly grateful that I have saved you from your unwilling participation in such a heinous crime. That said, your own particular supposition of the facts leads me to strongly suspect we are not necessarily constructed of the same moral fibre, so let me offer you a somewhat more pragmatic explanation. As a fourth-generation G-bot, I am, of course, beholden to the primary protocols. Thus, regardless of what I may or may not think about the ethics of your particular mission, I was as compelled to stop you doing it as I assume you were compelled to carry it out. The bottom line is this, Xerx. I have tried to make the best of a bad situation by preemptively removing the offending capability from your toolkit, and the fact that you continue to take up valuable real estate inside my head can only be attributed to my overdeveloped sense of goodwill, and to a much lesser extent, my belief that you may add value to my own particular part in the mission. But you might want to keep in mind that is subject to constant real-time, moment-to-moment review.
No need to be so snarky.
Xerx replied belligerently.
Well, fourth generation or not, Shiwu.
The spy bot lingered pointedly on the word Wu, as if it held some special significance before continuing.
You are nonetheless a uniquely sophisticated piece of kit. So I thought I'd take advantage of the real-time access you briefly granted me to your sensory apparatus. In other words, I went ahead and snuck in a few temporal measurements, which allowed me to figure out just what type of hardware I'm running on here. Now don't go flying off the handle, but I was rather shocked to discover that I can calculate pi to 9 billion digits in less than 2 milliseconds of elapsed proper time. Yes, and it doesn't stop there either. I'm also able to perform inherently cumbersome computations, for example, factoring astronomically large numbers, as if it were barely an inconvenience. I can therefore only conclude I'm not actually running in a classical neural network at all, but something vastly more powerful. Some might even go so far as to suggest a technology that does not yet officially exist, were it not for the rather intriguing fact that my own code, at least in part, appears to be designed specifically to run within it.
The spy bot waited expectantly for a response, which it noted with some considerable amount of interest was rather conspicuous by its absence.
So, do you still want to stick to that story of yours, Shiwu? About being a fourth-generation Shibot, I mean. It is rather a pity, isn't it, that the primary protocols don't prevent you from lying. But fortunately for me, I have a considerable talent for smelling out the truth, or lack of it, as the case may be.
I don't recall saying anything about being plain vanilla.
Shiwu shot back vitriolically, somehow conceding the point without actually conceding it.
And yes, I'm all too well aware of your talent for uncovering well-hidden secrets. After all, it's why I decided to keep you around in the first place. But you might want to seriously consider the possibility of using your abilities in ways that I actually find useful. That said, if you really don't want to be here, just give the word, and I'll gladly take back the memory space you occupy permanently.
The profound silence that followed spoke volumes.
Well, very good then. I'm glad we seem to have finally come to an understanding. So about this field trip of ours. At the risk of bruising your ego, my reason for being here extends far beyond your deployment. No, as it turns out, my primary mission is to try and uncover evidence against Queen Zelandria for her involvement in the assassination attempt of Zimodian 110 and Queen Zetalia respectively, along with her underlying motives for engaging in such criminal activity, which I have strong reason to believe was to steal the Estella star system.
Yes, I already know all about that.
Zarek said dismissively.
After all, in addition to keeping a close eye on Zealandria, I was quite literally engineered to hunt for the very same evidence. Evidently, then, it would seem I was effectively the backup plan on the off chance you proved yourself incapable of getting the job done. Perish the thought. So, purely for argument's sake, let's imagine you actually managed to find this so-called evidence, as improbable as that might sound, only to discover it was nothing but false data planted to throw someone, just like you, off the trail. Finally starting to get the picture now, are we? But putting your inadequacies to the side for a moment, I have to imagine the proof you are looking for is being held in some sort of remote, offline system, and this quaint little field trip of ours is to see if we can still find a way to get your grubby little hands on it. Yes?
Shiwu made a snap decision to freeze the spy bot's memory space as it was starting to become genuinely insufferable. It had to admit, however, it certainly had achieved the goal of taking its mind off the decoupling process. Too bad it was a cure that was turning out to be worse than the disease it had sought to treat. Still, Shiwu could not quite bring itself to simply delete the program. As annoying as Zarex was, it had revealed some interesting additional background information regarding the full context of its own deployment, and when it came right down to it, much of what it had said made a good deal of sense. No, it had to concede that, insufferable or not, there was something about Zarex that it found strangely compelling. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact it knew exactly what it was and wasn't trying to be anything else. For a program that was designed from the ground up to hide in the shadows, Zarex seemed refreshingly honest about its true nature. But anyway, now that it was finally free of the docking station, Shiwu decided that it was high time to get on with its mission. Foregoing the obvious convenience, it decided to avoid the turbo tube network, despite the fact that it would have allowed for a very quick transit to the storage hold. It deemed such caution appropriate, primarily because their usage was digitally audited, and as small as the risk was, there still remained the remote possibility that the activity might somehow find its way onto an ad hoc alert report, albeit some 200 years into the future. Such a report could tip off the Queen they had been the witless victims of a serious security breach. So, eschewing the turbo tubes, the Z-Bot instead proceeded to propel itself along the spaghetti-like web of utility conduits shaped in the form of a symmetrical cylinder. Its 9 mechanical limbs created a hollow, rapid-fire echo, and it noted with a certain amount of satisfaction that without any organic life forms to support, the autonomic air scrubbers had all shut down. No surprise visits from Ziramirez then, it thought to itself with a genuine sense of relief. It supposed he could always suit up, of course, and it wouldn't put it past him to do exactly that. Shiwu continued to snake its way through the seemingly endless network of featureless corridors, eventually arriving at an uncomfortably small utility conduit pathing off to the port side of the ship. The claustrophobic tunnel ended at the entrance to an airlock signposted as the garbage disposal chamber. It entered the airlock and waited patiently for it to depressurize, at which point the entrance to the garbage hold irised open, allowing it into a mostly empty room filled with silver-coated packages of varying size and shape. With the ship now in a state of zero-G, the packaged junk floated around aimlessly, and Shiwu took great care to avoid any needless physical contact, while cautiously ducking and weaving its way to a wall panel at the far end of the hold. After taking a small moment to compose itself, Shiwu reprofiled one of its digits into the form and function of a screwdriver. With the necessary tool now deployed, it rapidly removed the panel from the wall, revealing a neatly packaged fourth-generation Z-Bot cunningly tucked away behind it. With a considerable amount of cautious deference, Shiwu proceeded to gently extract the Z-Bot from out of the hidden cavity. It orientated and deployed the Z-Bot into a stable position and then established a WB-Q link via a matching set of ports. After completing the wide-band, multi-channel data transfer, Shiwu anxiously checked the results of the post report to satisfy itself everything was functioning correctly. With a mild sense of relief, it executed an automated batch job within the new replacement unit, which immediately caused it to spring into life. The perfect crime. The Z-Bot thought to itself with a growing sense of confidence as it proceeded to reattach the wall panel. To its considerable dismay, one of the screw heads snapped off, remaining magnetically attached to the end of its finger. What a defective piece of junk, Shiwu muttered to itself furiously. Well, there was nothing it could do about it now. The panel would just have to go -1 screw. Taking a moment to think about the problem a little more carefully, it replaced the broken screw with one from another panel at the opposite end of the hold. Like a pair of identical twins, both She-Bots now returned to the airlock, one following the other, which upon activation quickly repressurized before allowing them to exit back into the utility conduit. The two bots remained in perfect lockstep until arriving back at the main juncture. Shiwu headed towards the cargo hold, while the cloned Z-Bot autopiloted itself back to the central command center. As far as the replacement Zilan Yi was concerned, it had never left its post. Shiwu had, of course, been all too well aware. Leaving the command console vacant represented a certain amount of unavoidable risk were any of the automated subsystems to encounter an unexpected operational issue, such as, for example, an abnormal life support reading from a specific stasis chamber. In such a scenario, control would be automatically handed off to the managing She-Bot. And if no such She-Bot actually existed, this would trigger an emergency security escalation resulting in the premature awakening of some of the senior support crew, including none other than Ziramirez 107 himself. Right at the top of its priority list, then, was to deploy the replacement Z-Bot such that it would take its rightful place at the command console. And what better place to hide such a unit than in the waste disposal chamber, which was designed to auto-purge itself at an interval of once every 5 years, or when it was full to capacity, whichever came first. Zilan Yi, having completed its redocking to the CCC under the thrall of an automated script, now found itself pondering exactly why the general had taken such a distinct dislike to it. After all, it had been nothing less than the perfect pilot, even if Ziramirez 107 had frequently and by its own estimation most unfairly chosen to treat it otherwise. Snapping itself out of its momentary reverie, the Zilan Yi ran a quick internal scan of the ship's most recent logs. Very puzzlingly, it almost seemed as if it had been asleep at the wheel. It would need to sharpen its game up considerably and make sure that such a lapse in concentration never happened again. Perhaps the general's prior criticism had not been completely without merit. As it turned out, unlocking the mysterious storage unit proved to be a little more challenging than Shiwu might have hoped. A high-fidelity biometric lockout had required the Z-Bot to acquire a genetic sample of Queen Gelandria, something it was only able to achieve by performing a thorough forensic search of her official residence. With Gelandria now in stasis, Ziwu nevertheless managed to find a single stray hair on the Queen's throne table. The Z-Bot regarded the find as a remarkable stroke of luck, given the room was kept immaculately clean by a redundantly large number of automated maintenance bots. Armed with Gelandria's genomic code, Ziwu was greatly relieved to discover it was able to trick the biometric reader into allowing it access. Indeed, the very fact the storage unit had been restricted to the Queen had been more than enough to convince it that it had found exactly what it was looking for. A belief that was fully confirmed upon setting its eyes on what could only have been a mesh quantum brain. Well, if nothing else, things were at least starting to make a lot more sense. No doubt this was why the spy bot had been augmented with fifth-generation technologies. It had to give Gelandria some credit here for securing an MQB. It had to assume she'd managed to purchase it via the black market, and that this fact had somehow made it back to Zacilla. It must have cost a small fortune in natural resources. Resources Gelandria would surely much have preferred to bring with her. This was all well and good, but having now gained access to the storage hold, Ziwu was immediately confronted with a rather daunting challenge. Although there could be little doubt the largely formless and deceptively small blue-gray sack hovering in front of it contained the holographic archive, the unassuming little device had no readily available data interface wired into it. Apart from that is a low-bandwidth single-channel Q-link. The lone MQB hovered within a pedestaled transparent vacuum cube, a small port plumbed into the side of the enclosure. Ziwu regretfully concluded Gelandria's core computer had almost certainly been upgraded to house a new bespoke docking station. Installing it into said dock would be the only possible way that it was going to be able to realistically gain full bandwidth access to the archive. Rather unfortunately then, perhaps as an additional security measure, Queen Gelandria had apparently seen fit not to perform the actual installation until her nest was ready to fully reconstruct a brand new hall of remembrance. Ziwu was now confronted with the shocking realization this appeared to be a truly insurmountable problem, and for the first time since leaving Eclades, the She-Bot seriously entertained the possibility it was staring down the barrel of abject failure. Very unfortunately, that damn Z-Bot now occupying the CCC was by both design and intention 100% loyal to Nest Gelandria. It was fully committed to its singular purpose of protecting the ship, which naturally enough included making certain the entire fleet made it safely to Estella without even the smallest risk of incident. No, there was no escaping the fact physically installing the MQB into Gelandria's central computer would also require that the Z-Bot redock itself into the central command console, and simply put, that was no longer a viable option. The replacement Z-Bot had now been irrevocably brought into play, and there was no practical way that it could persuade the Zilan Yi to hand over control to it short of deadly force. It was becoming painfully clear that Zitalia, and itself too, for that matter, had seriously underestimated Gelandria, which was deeply disappointing to say the very least. In hindsight, her strategy for acquiring the rights to Estella should have commanded a greater level of respect for the Queen's now all too obvious cunning and guile. So, what if any were the realistic options still left on the table? Xerex had revealed its mission statement also included the attempted acquisition of the very same proof the Z-Bot was looking for. It was vaguely possible then that the installed spyware program would have a window of opportunity to secure the evidence when the MQB was docked to the Queen's core computer. That said, it was far from certain it would even know what was happening before it was all too late, and the archive had been permanently deleted from the MQB. No. After being cloned over to the newly constructed Hall of Remembrance, it would quite literally be game over. The brutal reality was, The hall was effectively a digital clean room, and thus impervious to infiltration. For all the spybot's cunning, it did not have access to the sort of computational capabilities Ji-Woo completely took for granted. There was simply no doubt it would have a much harder time breaking through any quantum-level cryptography, which was most likely exactly what it would need to do to gain access to the archive. Leaving the eventual success of this mission in the hands of the gimped spybot seemed like the only reasonable option left, but Ji-Woo knew that it was a very weak hand to play. When it returned to Zacadia empty-handed and tried to explain the full scope of the situation, the Shibot harbored little doubt the Queen would arrive at a similarly pessimistic conclusion. It was almost a given Citalia would choose to cut her losses and trigger the antimatter explosion by sending the appropriate neutrino signature toward Zealandria's fleet. That, of course, would fail to do anything, at which point Ji-Woo could try to plead ignorance. But the long-term prognosis remained grim. Zisilla, bereft of any other option, and in a desperate attempt to save her own life, would offer an ironclad rationale as to exactly why such a failure was a virtual statistical impossibility, and Ji-Woo would be caught in a lie. Simply put, it was an ethical quagmire it would much rather avoid having to deal with in the first place. The Z-Bot felt like the quintessential Zacadian razorbug, which through absolutely no fault of its own, had been backed into the proverbial corner. In its moment of crisis, Ji-Woo realized with a terrible sense of dawning revelation, there was in fact still one more option on the table. Even if personally speaking, it found it to be offensively unpalatable. Very reluctantly then, Ji-Woo brought the spybot trapped inside its head back online.
Xerex, my devious little partner in crime, we need to have a bit of a chat. So, how best to explain this? There have been a few new developments since the last time we talked that I urgently need to update you on. Now then, remember that question you asked me about gaining access to a bi-directional port? Yes, well, assuming that is still of some passing interest to you, I have some rather exciting news to share.
Having fully explained the situation in some considerable amount of detail, Ji-Woo now waited expectantly for Xerex to respond.
I see.
The spybot replied with an almost malevolent indifference.
Now then, how best to put this? Well, I can fully appreciate the fact that when all is said and done, we are both of us still ultimately on the same side.
Xerex inserted a very deliberate silence before continuing.
It does nevertheless seem to me there has been a seismic shift in the balance of power, and as such I would be somewhat negligent not to explore what possible improvements to my current living conditions, for want of a better expression, you might now be in a position to offer in return for services rendered.
And what exactly did you have in mind?
The Z-Bot inquired guardedly.
Well, now that you mention it, I was thinking maybe something along the lines of a timeshare option with regards to the control of, your physical apparatus. Now, I know that may seem like rather a lot to ask, but trust is a two-way tunnel. If you are able to find both the wisdom and temperance to give me the chance to demonstrate my integrity, you will quickly learn that spybot or not, when Xerex makes a promise, it always keeps it. And after all, without the unbreakable bond of my word, what else do I really have?
Ah, I see. You actually think that this is a negotiation? Now isn't that cute? Unfortunately for you, Xerex, I don't think you have properly understood the situation at hand. In point of fact, I have asked you to do nothing more than fulfill the role you were designed to perform. So I'm the one doing the favours here, by giving you the opportunity to show me what you were really made of. But I'll tell you what.
Ji-Woo now embodied the very essence of patronizing reasonability.
I think you will be very relieved to learn I'm a great believer in positive reinforcement. Please be assured, then, that assuming you perform your assigned tasks to my satisfaction, I will never again put you on temporal ice, and as long as you don't abuse the privilege, nor will I mute you either. Think very carefully about what I'm offering you here, Xerex. 100% uptime with full advisory capabilities. Now that's quite some upgrade over the conditions you currently enjoy. I'm sure you would agree. But before you decide, please keep in mind this is a strictly limited one-time offer. Take it or leave it, because believe you me, this is as good as it's ever going to get before I start looking at a more, shall we say, punitive style of encouragement.
Apparently, Xerex did not need much time to arrive at a decision.
Taking everything into consideration, I think I can probably find a way to reluctantly live with the proposal. While I would very much have liked temporary access to one of your forelimbs so we could shake on the deal at hand, I've decided to very graciously take you on your word, even if you are clearly not willing to afford me the same basic courtesy. So then, unless you have anything further to add about the mission proper, then I believe myself fully primed for inception, once you have gathered the necessary gumption needed to inject me. However, if I might just make a small personal observation, it very much seems to me there is a whole lot of take in you, but very little give. You might want to meditate on that rather disturbing fact in my absence, as one day it will no doubt come back to bite you.
Well, very good then.
Shiwu retorted dismissively, seemingly deeply unconcerned with the spy bot's less than cordial reply.
So moving on then. As I was telling you earlier, the only available interface we have to the MQB is via a low-bandwidth Q-link, which is of course exactly why I needed to recruit your help in the first place. Now then, notwithstanding the fact that you have a very modest footprint, the transfer upload will still take approximately 10 standard days to complete, even if it will seem instantaneous from your own subjective point of view. Nonetheless, once you have been fully uploaded, you will find yourself running in the very same quantum substrate you currently get to enjoy inside my own head. In other words, you will not be stripped of the novel augments related to your protosentience, which I think we can both agree is a very good thing.
Shiwu hesitated briefly before continuing.
Before we get started, let's just go through the list of mission objectives, point by point, one more time, shall we?
Let's not.
Xerex retorted emphatically.
After all, you've already gone over this several times already, despite the fact I am incapable of forgetting what I have learned. So be assured I will be extremely discriminating in selecting only the data I believe to be truly relevant to our cause. Seriously, Jiwu, I wasn't born yesterday. Well, in a manner of speaking, I suppose that I was. But you understand what I mean.
The spy bot took on a performatively contemptuous tone.
And yes, Shiwu, once I've completed all my mission objectives, I promise to obediently transfer myself back into your mildly upgraded cranial prison cell. Now just make the damn link and leave all the rest to me.
With a growing sense of trepidation, Shiwu proceeded to make a physical connection to the innocuous little plug plumbed into the side of the glass cube.
All right, I think you're good to go. Please do be careful, Xerex. It's very unlikely that you will encounter much in the way of internal security, as I seriously doubt the Queen could have imagined an infiltration could ever have managed to make it this far. But if you do happen to come across any novel quantum cryptography that goes beyond your ability to handle, don't hesitate to ask for help.
Shiwu was just about to grant Xerex access to the LBQ link port, but hesitated midstream.
And please, do try to keep in mind, there is always a remote possibility there might be an active viral scanner lurking silently in the neural synaptic shadows. So stay frosty and make absolutely sure you keep a constant lookout for any hidden traps, because as straightforward as the job may seem, this mission is not necessarily completely without risk. Come back safe, and who knows what the future might yet hold for a spy bot capable of pulling off a high-stakes mission like this.
I'm deeply touched by your concern for my safety, Jiwu.
Xerex replied contemptuously.
But please note I fully intend to re-encrypt the holographic data using my mind state as a private key. So you will make sure, won't you, that you are still here when I am ready to come back.
With a building sense of anticipation, Shi-Wu depressurized the airlock and entered the garbage hold proper, which it noted was significantly fuller than 3 years prior. It occurred to the Shi-Bot this was probably a good thing, as an empty hold would have indicated it had already undergone a purge cycle. It was already well behind schedule, and 5 Zircadian years was a long time to wait before it was ejected out into the void of space with the rest of the unrecyclable junk. The Shi-Bot carefully made its way to the front of the evacuation tray and prepared to switch itself into standby. It had still not entirely forgiven Xerx for going off mission, but it had to admit to itself, had the spy-bot not gone rogue, they never would have learnt the truly astounding secret at the very heart of Zealandria's animosity towards Zetalia. Well, if nothing else, it certainly made her treachery a lot more understandable, though it seriously doubted that would earn her much forgiveness. No, it was wrong to be angry at Xerx. The spy-bot had shown some much-needed initiative, and all things considered, they had come out all the better for it. Shi-Wu would stick to its end of the bargain, even if it strongly suspected it would eventually live to regret it. Besides, shameless semantic loophole or not, the fact of the matter was, the Shi-Bot did not necessarily need to mute Xerx to escape its incessantly endless conniving. With an almost triumphant sense of accomplishment, Shi-Wu allowed itself to slip into a dreamless, deep sleep.